Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The world is one family.
Now, so I want to welcome Puruesh Chaudhary, who is in Islamabad. And I've been following Puruesh's wonderful, stellar career for quite some time. I've particularly noticed your work with the Millennium Project. Yeah, okay, I think that's probably where you first appeared on my radar, you might say. Now, Puruesh I'm really excited because she's one of the few people that I know who has, works in a, here we go. Here's the curriculum vitae from ResearchGate, but I want to jump on Wikipedia and so on. So it's, I feel really honored to be talking to someone who's on Wikipedia. I think that's wonderful. So Puruesh, I'm as I said, I'm really grateful. This conversation is part of a global citizens history course called HIS140. It's run through the University of the Sunshine Coast, and I'm the course coordinator. I'm just really grateful that you agreed to give us some time, and really what I'm interested in is talking to you about global citizenship. What does it mean? And what are its implications, what are its drawbacks, so on like that. This is a conversation, as I said, as I assured you before we started the recording, so we can back and forth, and I'm also interested in things that might give you hope, because we in a media saturated world where we're often hearing about bad news, and I'm keen to sort of say, okay, for every bad news, there's also good news. And I'm looking at books over here on my shelf, like The War for Kindness by Zaki, who are looking at different ways of telling the human story. So I'm very keen to hear if you have any thoughts on that. But let's start off with, now, what does global citizenship mean to you, Puruesh?
Thanks, Marcus. I hope to make this as meaningful as possible for your students. I've heard this term so many times that I've never really was curious enough to really delve into what this really means. Mm-hmm. So it's basically my own interpretation of how I see global citizenship sort of moving forward. And first, like what we were talking about a little earlier before this recording also, is I feel the frame in which the frame that gives global citizenship any meaning, or it's very nation state centric. Yep. We still believe in those geographical boundaries, those geopolitical realities, and therefore a lot of the time our way of constructing what our identities are usually emerge from those places. And as much as the world evolved, as many few generations, probably 2-3 generations down, their way of looking at the world is entirely different from our way of looking at the world. And so we've got to be really cognizant of how they're thinking and how they're perceiving and how they're learning about their environment. And what I find is, through my lens, global citizens or citizenry is an identity from the place that we're born and from the places that we take that identity. And the more nuanced meaning that I would like to give this to is how we connect, how we know ourselves and connect with other humans across the world. And those connections go beyond those geographical confines. Yeah. And if we can give meaning to those connections, and it could be on the basis, in some cases, it could be on the basis of religion. In some cases, it could be based on certain values. It could be based on certain passions or communities that share the same interests. And so therefore, we've given a completely new meaning to what global citizenship is. Now, when I talk about a generation down, 2, 3 generations down, their entire life meaning comes from those identities.
So you're
And
talking
those,
about millennials, let's say
I'm
millennials.
talking about millennials and even Gen Zs or whatever you
Gen
call
Z,
them, because
yeah.
there are just so many different ways of
Categories.
actually looking at them. I mean, it's definitely not
I
our
mean, from
generation.
my perspective, you're a younger generation. So
No, no, don't let this give away. But but what I'm trying to say is, like, when I look at today's 20-year-old is so different from when I was 20 or when you were 20.
yeah, definitely.
And the way they look at the world is not through, and the way they experience the world is through their own digital reality.
Mhm.
And so when I say those digital realities, I mean, I'm not saying that they've lost contact with the physical aspect of their communities or their families and their friends, but they have a completely different world of their own. And so a person sitting in Islamabad, if you look at the gaming industry, he or she would have a completely different identity when he's connected or she's connected to 50 different players across the world. And that gives a whole new different outlook on what reality means for that individual. And so when you see that sense of and what I was trying to say earlier, that sense of belonging for those people doesn't really stem from how we feel our sense of belonging based on where we were born.
Yeah.
And so it's a very different way of looking at global citizenship, and I think much to do with how internet has transformed the way we perceive our own realities.
Yeah.
And in this variance, what I find is I was reading this concept around fluid identities.
Yep.
And I feel that concept really plays a significant role in terms of in the digital and cyberspace. And once we acquire that understanding, once we acquire that know-how in the current generation, we see that generation take that knowledge and take that know-how in different places of the world.
Yeah.
So that degree of learning that is happening today and the pace of learning which is happening today is very different. We had to think, we had to take days in making certain decisions. Now for them, it's like a matter of 8 to 12 seconds.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't have to dwell on a decision. If it's something important, if it's something meaningful, they don't have to. The way their data points connect is so much more faster than the way our data points connect. Yeah. And that is the speed in which we'll see global citizenry. I would say, like, you know, the way global consciousness would work in the next 40 years or 50 years is going to be completely different. We may not even... Yeah.
No, I was thinking there are drivers in that area. So you've indicated technology and the internet. That's where, you know, no longer is just the local environment outside playing a role in identity formation. It's to do with the tribes, the gamers. You're online, you're doing this, you can have avatars, your gender is flexible. I mean, your politics, you can keep it hidden, or you can be, you know, a ranting sort of neo-Nazi in one context and, you know, a greenie in the other context. You know, we can play. So a lot of it is boiled down to play within that space. But, you know, there are other drivers out there, aren't there? You know, that are... So I'll hand it back to you, but I just wanted to flag that.
You know, while you said this, I was thinking about how easy was it for those in power to manipulate our environment and give us a sense of meaning as to who we are today.
Yeah, sure.
I feel the dynamics is changing. People are now pursuing to find a meaning for who they are on their own.
Yeah.
And I feel that technology therefore becomes that enabling factor in making that happen. Yeah. Now, and then therefore the question then becomes the accessibility part. And that is more of a technical nature. That is more of a political thing. But the quest for that individual really remains within that individual. So
Yeah.
for instance, if anyone wants to find out what's happening in Paris, I mean, they could do it through learning about it online, going to libraries, talking to people who may be French descendant within the same location, or they could completely experience this on their own. Now, the metaverse gives us that ability to sort of create our own reality. So each one of us is trying to create their own reality, and that's what would give it the global consciousness more significance, because it sort of boils down to how curious, how imaginative, how creative we are as individuals. And if we are that way, let's assume if we are that way, then we'd find then the power dynamics would ultimately shift. So you want people, so how media, you want people to, media of the future would therefore need to encourage all these factors.
Yeah.
And not really confine you within your own environment, not be designed in a way that makes you less curious and less imaginative.
So curiosity is something that always interests me, because now I'm, as a teacher, I find some students are highly curious, but many students are not. They want to pass and they want to be told what to pass. I'm talking to you guys out there, right? But at the same time, curiosity mobilizes action. Yeah. And so I would say it's not in the interests of vested interest of powers to foster high levels of curiosity. For me, entertainment takes the place of curiosity, because often infotainment, you might call it. So if you want to find out, like you use your example of Paris, if you want to find out about Paris, you can go online, you can look it up, or you can get a book, and so on. My students, I would hope, would go off and think, okay, how long has Paris been around? Oh, look, it was only, it was a village, a muddy village in the 8th or 9th century. It didn't really amount to very much. I would hope that they bring some level of historical consciousness to that, so that then they could look at the future of a Paris or a Parisian future through that lens. We know that cities rise and fall. In your beautiful country, you've got the, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. You've got those amazing Indus Valley civilization remnants in the earth, but they don't exist anymore. So I'm just throwing that out to reflect back to.
Yes. The few of us who are curious would want to go back in history to understand what is the potential of different futures. We may want to do that, but because the domain in which we are in would enable us to think that way.
Yes.
So curiosity for the two of us would be very different from someone who's a lawyer, from someone who's an engineer, or for someone who's an Imagineer. For them, curiosities would be very so. Curiosity plays out very differently in different individuals.
Yeah.
And for some people, it would just be the sort of world we can create, not very much relying on what the past has been. And so their entire life journey would be based on how do we want to see the world. And so they would work towards it. The few people like us would say, okay, we need to go back in time to understand what it has been like, to sort of see how it's going to play out. Some people are just convinced by really having the privilege of just orchestrating how it's going to play out. Very less focus on what the past is. And sometimes when you, in some cases, when you look at the development programs that have been implemented in different parts of the world, that's how the development programs were designed. They were very
social engineering in a sense.
They were very disconnected from the context and from the history. And because they were very disconnected from the context and the history, very less significant effort was trickled down at a grassroots level. So whatever we saw was a very superficial way of seeing it. However, that doesn't mean that they have not acquired the impact that they were looking for. Maybe they did. Now, the whole question is, would it be sustainable enough in the next 50, 60 years to see
Yep.
what they did as an intervention would play out? Now, those things are sort of debatable, but I do see different development organizations really changing and bringing in this strategic foresight, futures way of thinking into their way of designing development programs. So I see where practically where things have changed, but also in ways that things are just the same and people are moving along.
Yeah.
And so energy, I feel the energy fields of different individuals really plays out in terms of how we interact with the rest of the world.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like the fact that you're associating individual experience, you could say, and where you invest yourself. Your identity is invested in being an engineer or a school teacher or a politician or whatever. So, and see that as energy, I think, is a really powerful way of reframing it. Now, I'm aware of time. I unfortunately have to keep my eye on the clock. So you talked about, the various interventions in terms of at a global level from UNDP and so on. Is that where you put hope, or where would you situate, your sense of hope in what's happening today? What's a weak signal that makes you, oh, that's pretty exciting? You mentioned the metaverse, you mentioned online, but is that where you place your hope, or is it actually somewhere quite different?
Oh yeah, it's very different. I mean, I see those as some of the invention and the discovery that influence our way of thinking. But I feel, and this is something I'm working on currently also, but what I feel is something genuinely much more important can either be the weak or the strong signal, is the degree of trust that we place in different people. And trust, I feel, is an important factor in all relationships, whether be it the relationship between two people, be relationship amongst communities, or even between state and citizen.
Yeah.
And so the more it diminishes, the more we see conflict. And the more we see conflict, we see misery, chaos, uncertainty, and so we should be, although we should be okay with the fallout, but we should also understand why do interests diverge, and why people are unable to trust the other person or an institution. So I feel even in the future, with even the technologies that are at play and the conflicts that still exist today, we have to understand that is essentially because we've not created enough of the negotiation space where we allow ourselves to either trust someone, to work with them, or to really foster that kind of relationships. And so we're 7 billion today.
Yeah.
And in 40 years, we're going to be like 11 billion or so.
Yeah.
So imagine how important this would be then.
So
I'm just thinking in terms of our own evolution, in terms of how we're moving.
Yeah. So this sense of trust, we can see areas where it's degraded, politically or whatever we might call it. But is there an example of positive trust emerging somewhere that you can give us as a closing sort of thing, just to end on an optimistic note?
Yeah, I mean, I see how, how young people, really trust one another, rely on those relationships.
Yeah.
When I see that play out, I feel like, okay, the one basic survival instrument is actually there.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of hope in how the young people are managing sort of their lives, and we're just there to sort of, guide them, or perhaps share whatever our experience if they're ever interested in. And so we're the people who keep that flock not moving in a direction that won't be good for the rest of the people.
Okay. Now that's lovely. So yeah, I'm very grateful that you've given us a little bit of time. It's been great to talk to you. I would really like to be able to do it for much longer, so that we could sort of burrow down into some of these things. There are a whole range of things you dropped into the conversation. Now, each one could be like a wormhole that we go down into. Oh, it's very exciting in that regard. But I thank you for your time, Puruesh. And
You're welcome.
yeah, hopefully I'll be able to catch up with you again, and we'll have a further conversation. All right.
Sounds good. Thanks, Marcus.
All right, then.